Hi everybody, and welcome to the fourth lesson of our class, Space, Lens, and Perspective. So today we're going to be talking about different types of perspective, how to get better at perspective, and camera lenses, which I think are really important if you want to work in film or animation or even games, anything that actually has a camera in it. So let's get started. We're going to be talking about different types of perspective, how to get better at perspective, and camera lenses, which I think are really important if you want to work in film or animation or even games, anything that actually has a camera in it. So let's get started. So there are three different types of perspective that most people know. So we're going to go over them really quickly just so we're all kind of on the same page language-wise. First one is one-point perspective. This is very, very straightforward in the sense that it is one vanishing point somewhere on the page, and then everything is going towards that vanishing point. It doesn't necessarily have to be on the page, but if it's off of the page, then we're kind of getting into two-point perspective territory. So usually for a one-point perspective, you will have the vanishing point on the page. Second type is two-point perspective. It's similar to the previous perspective with the 1 point, except now we have two different points and they're usually off the page. As we get into camera lenses, I'll explain a little bit more about why that is, why they're kind of so far apart. You can have them on the same page, but that kind of means that you're going to be using a wide-angle lens, and that can give you different types of storytelling effects. Third type is three-point perspective. So this is a third vanishing point that is going to be up in the sky or down on the ground, somewhere that takes all the vertical lines and actually has them vanishing up to a point as well. All humans we actually see in three-point perspective. This is a very natural thing. We use this in film and TV. We usually use it to emphasize something. We're usually using it to either say how tall something is or how low something is. There's also multiple vanishing points. There aren't just those three different types of perspectives. There's also any time that an object is not at a right angle, it's actually going to be its own vanishing point. So, for example, I've taken this photograph with all these different angled houses, and I'm going to draw over it, and I'm going to show you guys where all the different vanishing points are. So here is those vanishing points drawn out. As you can see, I plotted out three just on this horizon line, but there's definitely more. There's definitely another point from this top of this roofed line all the way down this way. So when you have multiple vanishing points, the thing you want to remember the most is that anything that is sitting on the ground or that isn't vanishing to the third vanishing point up in the sky, it's going to be on the same horizon line. So as we start sketching, you want to keep that in mind. You want to make sure that all of your different points for objects that are turned are going to be on the same horizon. So let's go over lenses really quickly. The reason why I think lens discussion is really important is because I think that you can do a lot with lenses. You can actually tell a different type of story based on what lens you choose. So the first one we're going to talk about is the standard lens. This is as close to the human eye as cameras get. This is really useful if you just want to have a very standard, very easy to look at kind of composition. The next one we're going to go over is telephoto. So telephoto is a really long lens, and what that does is it tends to flatten things out that are far away. So as you can see from these two different images, this has a lot more perspective than this does. Everything's flatter in this one. And you could use this in a lot of ways for different things, but I like using telephoto when I'm looking at something that's far away and I want it to be kind of graphic and not as dimensional. And something about that actually really helps if you're doing compositions that are very stylized. So telephoto is really useful for landscapes or buildings or anything that you might want to just flatten out and not have as much depth. So the opposite of a telephoto lens is the wide-angle lens. So this is kind of like a fisheye lens. I built these models in SketchUp and I just kind of used different cameras on them so that we get a look at what these different lenses are going to look like on the same object. So with a wide angle lens, you can kind of see that there's a lot of dimension. It's really, really pushed. And like I was talking about before with the 2-point perspective, these 2 points are probably sitting on the page. If we were to draw it out, that one of these points right there for all of these lines, and then the other point is almost on the page. It's over here. So that way you can kind of see how wide angle lenses feel very dramatic and you can really see all the perspective, but it also is a little jarring. So it's not something you want to use a lot or all the time. It's something that I think is really useful if you really want to push drama and if you really want to, make someone see something very up close. They could also be fun for landscapes or big cityscapes because I think it shows you a lot. You can see a lot more. Like if we go back from the wide angle lens and look at the telephoto, you can kind of see that like if we were to actually build a whole city in this scene, you wouldn't see as much because you would only get to see kind of these buildings on the sides of it, as opposed to in the wide angle lens, you'd see a lot more. So if you definitely want to like show a huge space, then this is a really great way to go. The one thing to remember about 3D models is that the way that the perspective works is always going to be linear. But for a wide angle lens, our eyes and most camera lenses actually are going to curve a little. So although this model is a great starting point, if you were going to actually sketch something like this out, I would keep in mind that all these lines are actually going to curve a little bit towards the vanishing point, but they're going to not look quite as straight as the model is making it appear. And that's going to make it feel a little more naturalistic and a little less computery. It's going to make it feel more like it's from an actual camera and not generated from a computer. You'll notice this a lot in video games because the way that their engines operate, like they can't really put in that curvature. You can add it later, which is what a lot of films do for CG. But in games, because it's generating as you're going, you're always going to see it kind of like this, where everything's really, really straight. So that's something to kind of watch out for as you guys are moving forward with your homework. All right, so in this next section, I'm going to show you guys kind of what the homework is going to be. It's all about training your eye. It's all about learning to be able to see perspective and understand when things are a little off. And I think that's kind of the best way to go about it. There's a lot of rules and a lot of math in perspective. And I think that can feel really intimidating for a lot of us. When I started at Disney, my mentor, Kevin Nelson, who is an incredible draftsman, layout artist, he just drew the most beautiful drawings in perspective. And at the time, I felt like my perspective was pretty weak. So I was constantly asking him like, hey, how do I get better at this? And although he was an amazing mentor, his advice at the time didn't make a lot of sense to me. He basically said, oh, you just kind of get it after a while. And the strangest thing is that he's right. Like you can do all the math that you want, but at the end of the day, what you're just training yourself to do is to be able to see it and to be able to know, okay, this feels right, this doesn't feel right. So for me, one of the best ways that I was able to get there was actually drawing over photographs. As you've seen, I've used a lot of photographic examples in terms of perspective, but in this next exercise, we're going to actually break down a photograph and find its vanishing points and learn to see that perspective for ourselves. So in this photograph, it is a pretty simple room and interior. And I picked it because it has some very clear lines for where the vanishing points are going. So what I'm going to do is copy this over and make it smaller. Because since we know that most of the time in a 2-point perspective, which this is, you're going to actually not see the vanishing points on the page, right? So we need to be able to have enough room to be able to draw out those vanishing points accurately. So I'm going to just turn down the detail on this a little bit just so the lines on top we can really see, and then create a new layer. And then in my new layer, I'm going to actually start trying to find the 2 vanishing points. You can kind of see that these angles are leading towards somewhere in the middle here. And the first thing we want to do is find the horizon line. Like I said before, when we have multiple vanishing points, we need to be able to find the horizon line. Those things need to be sitting together. Most of the time, that's going to be a straight horizontal line. The only time when it's not going to be a horizontal line is when you're dutching the angle. So if you were to have a horizon line that's like that, it's just a little bit off, which is not quite enough to be off, and it's not quite enough to be straight. So you never kind of want to be in this uncomfortable zone. You either want it to be straight or you want it to be at a complete angle like that. Because a Dutch angle can be really useful for storytelling if you want to make people feel uneasy. If you have like a horror story or if you're trying to just increase the tension, you can definitely use a Dutch angle. But you always want to try to make sure that it's going to be a straight horizon line if your piece is very calm and neutral, which is what this is. So I'm going to look for my vanishing points right now, and I'm going to do that by looking at these straight lines and just sketching one out as far as I can. And then another object like the bottom of that, also kind of following that line and trying to find it. So as you can see already, like I haven't put this out far enough because these are not going to even be on this page. So I'm going to make this smaller, shrink everything down a little bit. So one more time, make this smaller. And that's one of the things that I think most people don't notice when they're actually doing their perspective drawings. A lot of times people just put the two vanishing points too close together because you don't really understand what it's going to look like in the end. As you can see, like this vanishing point is quite far from our page actually. And that really does help it feel natural. Okay, so I'm going to draw out my horizon line because your horizon line is always going to be, or not always, but is usually horizontal from your vanishing point. And now we need to just find the other angle for this vanishing point. So I'm using this roof line to find it, and it should be right about there. It would be better if I had a second angle that I could draw from just to double check to make sure that's actually the vanishing point, but unfortunately that's kind of the only real solid line that's going in this direction. As you can see, like this vanishing point is very far off in this direction, and this one's a lot closer, right, to the page. And that is actually a really great technique to use when you're doing 2-point perspective, because if you have it totally even, like all of your drawing takes place right here in the middle, it actually makes your piece really boring because all of your angles are going to be perfect right angles to each other, and it's going to feel very staged and not necessarily in a good way. This technique could work if you're trying to do something that, you know, that's the idea that you want, like that's the story behind the image, something very stable, very, very straight, very, very orderly. There could be a character whose space is like that, and that could be very good for you and your storytelling. But if you want to do something that has a little bit more personality to it, I like to kind of make sure that my drawing is taking place somewhere on this scale, not quite in the middle and not quite on either side. It's kind of that thing that we keep going back to, right? The balance and contrast thing. And in this sense, the fact that this drawing is going to sit right here on this horizon line is actually like a nice balance, right? It's like has enough contrast, but at the same time isn't like so contrasty. And it's still like sitting on the right horizon line and it's giving us a little bit of interest. All right, so I'm going to actually blow this up a little bit so it's not quite so tiny on the page. And then I'm going to finish kind of drawing out vanishing points. So the nice thing about this image too is that like all of these objects in here, I don't have a lot of turned things, right? Everything's pretty straight, and that actually does help me to be able to see the perspective well. This is 2-point and not 3-point because we are not getting convergence on the top. So it's a very, very stable looking image. And I think that that's really helpful for this very calm looking window scene. So this chair is kind of interesting because this is the first turned object that we have. So we can find its vanishing point, which is going to be right here. And then it's going to have a corresponding second vanishing point somewhere over here. It's still going to be going towards the horizon line. So that's how you know that it's still working. So that's kind of just the layout of the perspective for this shot. If I was actually going to practice a little bit more, I would actually try to sketch out all these objects in here and try to do it without having the actual image right underneath. So first I'm going to actually draw a box so I know what my image frame is going to be. Just going to stroke it with black so I can kind of see it. And then I'm going to move the image away. So I'm just using it as reference. And now I have all these vanishing points, so I know kind of what the perspective is going to be. I'm going to also sketch in kind of the verticals, just because I think it helps with the sketching portion of this. I'm just going to do them evenly so I can kind of see it. So I'm going to turn down all of my perspective guides so they're not like screaming at me and just kind of ghost them in. I usually just take the fill and push it down to like 15% or so. So they're still kind of there, but then, you know, you're not too distracted by them, but they're still going to guide you. Basically what I'm going to do now is I'm going to look at this and try to do my best interpretation of it. So we know that these two lines are the roof line. I'm going to sketch that corner of the room. And even though we didn't sketch in like all of these little shelves that are going to this horizon line, because we have it already kind of established in here, it's a lot easier for me to just kind of find it, right? Like I know that it's going to be not parallel to this line. It's going to be converging slightly, but not so far as these lines. I think it's a little too low. I'm going to move it up a little tiny bit. And then there's kind of this wall corner here, which is pushing in. So I'm going to sketch that in. And then we have the lines for the chair, so I'm going to sketch in the chair. It's got a fancy little foot. Now I'm just kind of sketching in the big window. And again, because I kind of have the guidelines for the rest of the vanishing points, I don't actually have to draw each and every single one out to the vanishing point. I can just kind of look at it and know, okay, well, this is between these two lines. And I'm purposely actually making this at an angle because I just think that design-wise it'll be interesting, but I know that it's not in perspective. And then the second vanishing point for the seat. And we're not actually going to see this side of it, this edge of it, because this bookshelf is going to come out.